Thank you, friends. I'm Emil. I'm a junior at Sandspring right now, and I'm going to be introducing Gene Sharp, his concept of dictatorship, and I'm going to be using the Ukraine as an example.
This is Gene Sharp. He's a professor, author, intellectual. He's been described as the most important man you've never heard of. His ideas have been influential in nonviolent democratic movements from places like the Ukraine, obviously, the Baltic states, and especially the Arab Spring. He's best known for his pamphlet From Dictatorship to Democracy, a conceptual framework for liberation, which is essentially a how-to manual on nonviolent struggles against dictators. He was the subject of a 2012 documentary, How to Start a Revolution, which focused mainly on how his ideas influenced the Arab uprising, and he has dedicated his entire life to fighting dictatorship in all of its forms. Now, during his lifetime, the nature of dictatorships has changed somewhat, from a classical, authoritarian, thuggish style of dictatorship, which was characterized by the Cold War. Many of these countries were supported by the United States, others by the Soviet Union, to a much more modern, savvy, technologically active, intelligent dictatorship, which you can see in countries like modern China, modern Russia, and to a lesser extent, Turkey, and even countries like Argentina, which are only sort of dictatorships. Freedom House, an NGO, ranks countries on the level of freedom they have, and according to Freedom House's 2013 rankings, over half the world is ranked as either not free or only partly free. So that basically means that half the people in the world are living under some form of dictatorship. One of these countries is the Ukraine, and Ukraine's had a very rough transition after the fall of the Soviet Union. Immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, a regime was in place. They weren't especially powerful, not especially centralized. It was ruled for most of that time by a man by the name of Leonid Kuchma until 2003, where presidential elections were held, and this man, Viktor Yanukovych, officially won, although it was to some extent rigged. He was supported by Russia. A nonviolent uprising occurred against him that was informed in part by Gene Sharp. And this man, Viktor Yushchenko, won in a later vote, which was widely agreed to be fair. Yushchenko held office for 10 years. Yanukovych won a presidential election fairly in 2010. And since 2010, the Ukraine has been under a dictatorship, but not the traditional style of dictatorship that we're all familiar with. It was essentially an external dictatorship. Rather than an internal regime acting as the dictator, a foreign state, in this case Russia, was the dictator of the Ukraine. This happened mainly in three ways: economically, militarily, and politically. Economically, Russia was able to control the Ukraine mostly through the use of its state oil company, Gazprom. They would raise and lower the price of gas arbitrarily based on political motivations. Politically, Russia supported the party of Viktor Yanukovych, the Party of Regions, which was strong in the Crimea and the east of the Ukraine, which is ethnically Russian. And militarily, Russia has, or had, one of its largest bases in the Crimea, which they've recently annexed, illegally I'd say. And they've been fomenting revolution in the east of the country. The way that Russia has been able to get away with this is because the world essentially hasn't stepped up. We haven't said that it's not okay for a foreign state to act as a dictator in its sovereign nation. Russia actually reneged on a promise they made in the 1995 Budapest Memorandum, where the Ukraine promised to give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of territorial integrity, which Russia clearly violated when it annexed the Crimea recently. And Russia's been able to get away with this not just because we haven't done anything, but because the Ukraine hasn't done anything. They essentially made themselves susceptible to a foreign dictatorship. There is a large ethnic Russian faction in the east of the Ukraine, and Russia used this as a pretext for invasion. But there are also large Russian minorities, even larger than the Ukraine, in most of the Baltic states. And none of them have been bullied by Russia the way that Ukraine has. And this is mainly economic, because the Ukraine is not economically strong. They are not economically integrated with Europe. All of the Baltic states are in the EU. The Ukraine hasn't even begun accession talks, unfortunately. The Ukraine is not anywhere near as strong economically or militarily or politically as the Baltic states were. So the Ukraine has a choice, basically. It can continue to allow itself to be ruled by the external dictator, Russia, or it can move on its own path, hopefully towards Europe, hopefully to be integrated with the EU. I'm now going to introduce Albert, who will be talking about the constituencies that must be co-opted to do this. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Albert.